The village of Tomtor sits in the Oymyakon district of the Sakha Republic, in the part of Siberia that holds the unofficial title of the coldest inhabited place on Earth. In January, the thermometer there regularly drops below -60. The air becomes so cold that it stops feeling like air. It becomes something thicker, something that presses against your face and fills your lungs with a burning sensation that never quite goes away, no matter how many winters you have lived through. The residents of Tomtor know this cold, the way city people know traffic, as a background condition of existence, permanent and indifferent, requiring constant management, but no longer capable of surprising them. Alexandra Prokopievna Sivtseva had lived in Tomtor for 81 years. She was born there, married there, buried her husband there 11 years before this story begins, and had no intention of dying anywhere else. She was a small woman, had always been small, her children said, even before age compressed her further, with hands that were disproportionately strong from a lifetime of physical work and eyes that people who met her remembered afterward, without always being able to say exactly why. Clear, dark, attentive, the kind of eyes that miss very little. She lived alone in a wooden house at the eastern edge of the village, not the edge where the road ends and the buildings thin out into empty lots, the real edge, where the last house gives way to open land and then, within a few hundred meters, to the taiga. The forest in winter was silent and enormous, and on nights when the cold was especially severe, the trees cracked with sounds like rifle shots as the sap inside them froze and expanded. Alexandra had slept through these sounds for 8 decades and no longer heard them, in the way that people stop hearing the sounds that have always been there. Her daily routine in winter was tight and practical, shaped entirely by the demands of survival in extreme cold. She woke before light, stoked the wood stove that heated the main room and the small adjacent kitchen, put water on to boil, fed the 2 dogs she kept in the enclosed porch, large mixed-breed animals named Buyan and Tioma, kept not for company, but for the specific purpose of alerting her to anything that came near the house from the direction of the forest. She had learned over decades that the taiga in winter was not empty. It moved toward human settlements when the cold deepened and the prey animals became scarce, and the dogs were her early warning system, reliable and loud. On the morning of January 14th, she remembered the date precisely because it was 2 days before her granddaughter's birthday, and she had been thinking about what to send. She woke at 5:30 to find Buyan and Tioma both pressed against the inner door of the porch, not barking, but making a low, continuous sound that she had learned to distinguish from their alert to predator sound. This was different, lower, almost confused. She dressed in her full winter layers. This took several minutes and was not a casual process, because at -68, which was the temperature that morning according to the outdoor thermometer nailed to the porch post, the difference between properly dressed and improperly dressed was the difference between a short errand and a medical emergency, and opened the outer door. The cold entered the porch like a physical presence, even through the wool scarf wrapped across her face and the fur-lined hood pulled forward. She felt it immediately in her eyes and in the narrow strip of skin between the scarf and the hood. She stepped out onto the porch steps and looked toward the area where the dogs had been directing their attention, the left side of the yard, near the low wooden fence that separated the property from the open land beyond. It took her a moment to understand what she was seeing. On the ground next to the fence, half covered by the snow that had blown against it during the night, was a large bird. Even from the porch steps, even in the pre-dawn dark, lit only by the light spilling from the open door behind her and the faint blue that precedes sunrise in the north, she could see it was an eagle. A Steller's sea eagle. She knew them, had seen them occasionally over the years near the river, enormous birds with wingspans that seemed impossible for a living thing. This one was on its side, one wing extended at an unnatural angle, not moving. Alexandra went back inside for her flashlight and went out again. The eagle was alive. She confirmed this before anything else, because there was no point approaching a dead animal in that cold when she had a stove to tend and a day to manage. Its chest was moving, barely, in the shallow way that creatures breathe when they are very close to the edge. The extended wing was not broken. She could see this when she crouched and looked carefully, though crouching at her age in those temperatures was its own small ordeal. But the primary feathers were thick with ice, each one coated in a layer that had built up over what must have been hours of lying in the snow. The eagle could not have flown even if it had the strength to try. The ice on the feathers alone would have made flight impossible. She stood up and looked around the yard, because the eagle being there was strange enough to warrant looking for an explanation. And she found one, or the beginning of one, several meters away, between the fence and a snow-covered wooden storage box she kept garden tools in during winter. She saw a second shape, smaller, much smaller. She walked toward it and crouched again and found a chick, not a newborn, months old already, large enough to be recognizable as an eagle rather than an undifferentiated mass of feathers, but nowhere near full grown. It was tucked into the space between the box and the fence in a way that looked deliberate, as though someone or something had placed it there specifically to use the box as a windbreak. It was alive. It was also covered in ice, but less severely than the adult. The sheltered position had protected it from the worst of the wind. Alexandra looked at the adult eagle, then at the chick, then at the temperature on the outdoor thermometer, then at the sky, which was beginning to lighten in the way that January skies in Yakutia lighten, slowly, reluctantly, as though the sun itself is not certain the effort is worthwhile. She calculated the situation in the practical way she calculated all situations. The eagles could not stay outside, the adult would be dead within hours, and the chick within a day if the cold continued, which it would, because cold in January in Tomtor does not stop for biological emergencies. Bringing them inside was complicated, but not impossible. She had a large wooden crate in the back room that she used for storing root vegetables, and that was, at the moment, empty because the root vegetables had been moved to the cellar in October. The crate was large enough. The back room was the coolest room in the house. She could close the connecting door and keep it from getting too warm, which she understood instinctively without being able to articulate the science, was probably better for wild birds than the main room with its stove. She went inside and moved the crate to the center of the back room. Then she went back outside with the heavy canvas work gloves she used for winter wood splitting, which were the thickest gloves she owned, and she picked up the chick first. It was easier, smaller, less dangerous, and carried it inside and put it in the crate on a bed of old wool blankets she folded in the bottom. Then she went back out for the adult, which was the harder problem. A Steller's sea eagle is a very large bird. The adult females reach up to 9 kilograms, and even the males are substantial animals with talons designed to grip and tear. An injured hypothermic eagle is not predictable, and Alexandra knew this. But she also knew that an eagle that had been lying in -68 for most of a night had very limited reserves for either attack or resistance, and she was right. She wrapped the bird in the canvas tarpaulin she kept in the woodshed, moving carefully and slowly, and carried it inside in 2 awkward trips that she would feel in her back for the following week. She put the adult in the crate beside the chick, covered part of the top with a wooden board to reduce the stress of open exposure, left a gap for air, put a shallow dish of water inside, and closed the back room door. Then she called her neighbor Prokopy Nikolaevich, who was 74, and the person in the village she called when she needed help with something that required either a second pair of hands or a working mobile phone with a reliable connection to the outside world. She had a landline. The mobile signal in Tomtor was unreliable in extreme cold because the equipment froze, and she reached him on the second ring. She told him what she had. He was quiet for a moment and then said he would call Yakutsk. The call to Yakutsk, to the wildlife rehabilitation contacts that Prokopy had in a notebook, he kept precisely for situations like this, not eagle situations specifically, but taiga-adjacent situations that fell outside the normal scope of village life, took most of the morning. The people in Yakutsk were helpful but distant, and distant in January in Yakutia means something very specific. The roads between Tomtor and anywhere with an avian specialist were not roads that could be traveled quickly or easily in those temperatures, and the earliest anyone could realistically arrive was 2 days. Alexandra received this information, thanked Prokopy, and went to the back room to see how her patients were doing. The chick was more alert than she expected. It was sitting upright in the corner of the crate, watching her with the focused, unblinking attention of young raptors, and when she placed a small piece of the frozen fish she kept in the outdoor cold storage, which in January required no refrigeration since the outdoor temperature was more effective than any freezer, near it in the crate, it looked at the fish for a long moment, and then, with the tentative deliberateness of an animal that is hungry but not certain of the rules, ate it. The adult was harder to read. It was lying on its side still, but breathing more steadily than it had been in the yard, and when Alexandra slowly lifted the board covering the top of the crate to look in, the eagle turned its head and looked at her with one eye. A yellow eye, the color of old amber, with the particular quality of intelligence in it that eagles have and that always slightly unsettled her even after a lifetime of proximity to wild things. She did not try to force it to eat. She left fish in the crate and covered it again and left the room. Over the following 2 days, she established a routine. She checked the back room every 3 hours, changed the water, which froze if she left it too long, even inside, because the back room was kept at a temperature only slightly above freezing, replaced the fish, and otherwise left the birds alone. The chick ate consistently and with increasing confidence. The adult ate on the 2nd day. She found the fish gone when she checked at midday and felt a specific relief that she did not examine too closely, because she had learned over decades that the examined relief is the relief that hurts most when the outcome is bad. On the evening of the 2nd day, Prokopi called to say the specialist was coming in the morning, a young biologist from the raptor conservation program in Yakutsk, who had driven part way and was staying overnight in the town of Ust-Nera before completing the journey. His name was Semyon, and he arrived the next morning at 9:30 in a vehicle that had clearly had a difficult night and a driver who looked only slightly better than the vehicle. He was in his late 20s, tall, with the layered competence of someone who spent a lot of time in conditions where incompetence had serious consequences. He spent 40 minutes with the birds before he said anything to Alexandra, beyond the brief professional courtesies of arrival. When he came out of the back room, he sat at her kitchen table and accepted the tea she had ready because she had known he would need it, and he told her what he had found. The adult was a female. He had confirmed this from the size and other physical markers. She had no structural injuries that he could find, which had been his primary concern. The hypothermia and ice accumulation had been the crisis, and she had come through it without lasting damage as far as he could assess, though a full examination under better conditions would be needed to be certain. The chick was male, approximately 5 to 6 months old, and was in surprisingly good condition given what he had been through. Semyon said this twice, surprisingly good, and looked at Alexandra with an expression that combined professional respect with something more personal. He asked her how she had known to keep the room cool rather than warm. She said she had not known. She had kept it cool because it was the back room, and it stayed cool, and she had not thought to change that. Semyon said that was exactly right, that warming a hypothermic raptor too quickly causes shock, and that many people's instinct to bring a cold animal into a warm room was precisely the wrong instinct. Alexandra said she was glad she had not had that instinct. Semyon smiled for the first time since arriving. The question of what to do next was straightforward in outline and complicated in practice. The birds needed to be transported to the rehabilitation facility in Yakutsk, a journey of several hundred kilometers in January that was not simple under any circumstances. The female needed to be stable enough for transport, which Semyon assessed she would be within another day. The chick was ready now. He asked Alexandra if she could manage one more day of what she had been doing, and she looked at him with the expression of a person who has been managing difficult things for 8 decades and does not require the question framed as a favor. He stayed the night. She had a spare room, and the drive back to Ust-Nera and then on to Yakutsk in January darkness was not a drive anyone should make who could avoid it. They ate dinner together, and she asked him about his work, and he talked about it with the particular animation of someone who does not often get to explain what they do to someone who is genuinely listening. He told her about the Steller's sea eagle population, that it was one of the rarest eagles in the world, with a total wild population estimated at somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 individuals, almost all of them in the Russian Far East and Siberia. That the birds faced serious pressure from habitat loss, lead poisoning from ingesting ammunition and hunted prey, and the general unpredictability of survival in one of the planet's most extreme environments. That every individual mattered in a way that was not sentimental but mathematical. The population was small enough that individual animals had measurable significance to the overall health of the gene pool. Alexandra listened to all of this and then asked a question that Semyon, recounting the conversation later, said he had not expected. She asked whether the female and the chick were related. He said almost certainly. A female in that location in January with a chick of that age was almost certainly the mother. Alexandra nodded slowly and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "That explains it." Semyon asked what she meant. She said, "Why she did not leave." The female was fully conscious for most of those 2 days. She could have moved, could have tried to get away. She did not try. Alexandra had assumed it was weakness, but now she thought perhaps it was not only weakness. Semyon looked at her for a long moment and said he thought she might be right, and that this was the kind of observation that field biologists spent careers trying to articulate. They transported the birds the following morning. Semyon loaded the crate into his vehicle with the careful efficiency of practice, and Alexandra stood on the porch steps in her full winter layers and watched. The temperature was -64, slightly warmer than it had been 3 days earlier, which in this context counted as improvement. Before he drove away, Semyon rolled down the window and told her that the rehabilitation facility would send her updates on the bird's progress if she wanted them. She said she wanted them. He said he would make sure she received them. The updates came by letter. She had asked for letters rather than email because she had no computer and did not intend to acquire one at this stage of her life, and Semyon had written down her postal address without comment. The first letter arrived 6 weeks later. The female had been assessed as fully recovered and was being held in a large outdoor enclosure to maintain her fitness before release. The chick was growing well and eating aggressively, which Semyon noted was the best possible sign. The second letter came in April. The female had been released in late March, fitted with a satellite tracking tag. The chick would be released in summer when he was fully flight capable. The third letter arrived in September. It was longer than the others. Semyon wrote that the tracking data from the female showed she had returned to the Oymyakon region, not to the immediate vicinity of Tomtor, but to the river valley within 20 kilometers, which was within her established range. The chick had been released in July and had been tracked moving southeast, which was normal dispersal behavior for a young male establishing his own territory. Both birds were alive. Both were behaving normally. The rehabilitation had, by every measurable standard, succeeded. At the end of the letter, Semyon had written a paragraph that was not about the data. He wrote that in his work he encountered many people who helped injured animals, and that most of them did so instinctively, without thinking about what they were doing or why, and that this was good and worth something. But he had thought about Alexandra specifically, he wrote, because of the thing she had said at dinner, about the female not leaving, about the explanation. He had talked about it with colleagues at the facility, and they had discussed it in the context of a broader question about whether birds, and specifically raptors, showed anything that could be called trust toward the humans who helped them. The science was complicated, and the word trust was probably not the right word. But he wanted her to know that her observation had started a conversation that was still going. He thought she would want to know that. Alexandra read the letter twice at the kitchen table, with her tea going cold beside her, which was something she never allowed to happen. Then she folded it carefully and put it with the other 2 letters in the drawer of the sideboard where she kept things that mattered. Outside, Buyan and Tioma were in the yard, moving in their slow winter way. The taiga was at the edge of the property, enormous and silent. Somewhere in the river valley 20 kilometers away, if the tracking data was right, a large female eagle with a satellite tag was living her life in the cold that she had been built for, in the landscape that was hers. Alexandra sat for a while at the table and then got up and stoked the stove, because the morning was advancing and there was wood to bring in and water to boil and a day to manage. She was 81 years old, and she had lived in this place her entire life, and she understood it in the way that you can only understand a place when you have never been anywhere else and have never wanted to be. She understood that the taiga gives and takes without reference to human preference or schedule, that its gestures toward the people who live at its edge are rare and usually ambiguous, and that when something comes out of it toward you, limping, frozen, barely alive, with a chick tucked against a wooden box for shelter, the correct response is not to ask why. The correct response is to go and get your canvas gloves,